Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome back. We had a 2-week hiatus following Passover, so I hope everyone had a wonderful and freeing, transcendent holiday. We won't take any polls here how transcendent it was, but suffice it to say, I bless you all that the transcendence should carry over to the rest of the year. As we all know, inspiration is one half of the story. Maintenance contracts are always more expensive than the initial contact. So, to maintain inspiration is a much greater challenge than to get inspired or to get somebody inspired. Because then it deals with the follow-up of having to integrate it into our lives, and with all the ups and downs, the vicissitudes and challenges of life. And of course, as they say, once the honeymoon is over and the novelty and the initial euphoria of any new experience wears off, the question is what happens next, the morning after the hangover. Anyway, with enough analogies, the point is that the real challenge of life is to be able to integrate deeper spiritual truths and higher states of consciousness, if you wish, into the daily grind of life. And the grind is a real grind because each of us has our own challenges, work, at home, balancing the two. And when you throw into the equation the wounds that we have, that some of us, the wounds that we lick from our childhoods, the things we were deprived of, the lack of nurturing or the over-nurturing, it gets quite complex. Like whenever anyone asks you, so how are things? So of course the easy answer is it's pretty good, people like to say. And more religious people will say, thank God. Which really, both of them are a meaningless answer. And the reason, of course, is, as they say, the cliche goes that when someone asks you, how are you, don't tell them about your indigestion, because how are you is a greeting, not a question. You get the rhyme. So in other words, but once you need the surface, and you really get into conversation, someone asks you, so what's going on in your life? You know, a good word to use is, it's complex. I see on Facebook a lot of people, relationship status, it's complex. And then there's the modern term called issues. We've got issues, and we've got all kinds of stuff. So I'm not getting into analysis of all that and what it means. What I will say is that, for myself, the greatest challenge has always been, and especially as the years roll on, has been the hard part. Not the initial inspiration or the initial so-called exposure to something powerful, but returning back home to tell about it. You know, you find many of the, as I mentioned, I think in the last class that we had before Passover, talked about the highs that people experience, some of them through foreign substances. So you have the geniuses, the brilliant musicians and artists in the late 60s, who, in their search for beyond the doors of perception, in William Blake's words, went so far beyond they couldn't return. Some physically couldn't return, some mentally could not return. Because when you do experience, especially a spiritual exposure, it's not that easy to go back to so-called mundane life, where you don't have all that excitement. It was always, the vision for me was always, one of the saddest images is when you see great artists who stand on a stage, entertaining, and more than entertaining even, touching, and having, you could say, a transcendent experience with 10,000 people, 100,000 people, who's counting. But the saddest part is when everybody leaves, and they pack up their bags and their guitar, and have to walk home alone. So I know there's a thing called groupies, it's not always alone, but it's still alone. And that is just to demonstrate the contrast of when you're going to get out of mediocrity into something that is really exciting, That's one part of it. The question is, do you have a plan for stage 2, when you have to return, when you have to go back home? There was a guy that came to this class many years ago. I'm not going to mention names, but some of you may know who he is. And he was a celebrity in his time, in the 60s. And he told me that the adulation he got on stage completely destroyed his life. Because when he'd come home to his wife, he expected her to treat him the same way. And it doesn't work that way in day-to-day life. And it created a whole distortion of his own sense of self, sense of entitlement, distortion of the whole who am I, relationships. And he's still in his own mind as a celebrity, and goes through his own motions, even if he's aware of it. So the challenge of integration is a very deep one for everyone, and especially those that have the deepest experiences. Because if you don't have them, then there's not much to integrate. But when you do, it's very difficult to return. So in many ways, this has always been the challenge of mystics, and even of all of us in our own way. After a holiday, if you truly experience the transcendence of the holiday, and I mean not the mechanical part of Passover or the so-called robotic elements of it, but if you experience it on any spiritual level, it's always a challenge afterwards how to integrate. And this is true after Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, and Sukkot, and this is true after any type of transcendental experience. So the theme of this evening, I've decided to do, being that it's coming after the holiday, and it's also a particular period in the Jewish calendar, was, can we change? Can we change ourselves? It's a question that is, I would say, maybe one of the most fundamental questions, because all of us at times feel stuck, and at times feel like the more things change, the more they stay the same. And this can be in relationships, this could be the mistakes we make that we repeat again and again. It can be many different ways that this manifests itself. But it all comes really down to our own personalities. If you're wired a certain way, can a leopard change its spots? Or a tiger its stripes? They both have been used. Not my original one. And the same with human beings. We all have our spots and our stripes, which means we have our genetic structures, we have our hereditary features, and we also have our influences, especially at early age. Things that what influences us in those impressionable years. As one of the analogies given by one of the Rebbes is that we are like a warm ball of wax when we're born, very warm. And warm wax is very impressionable. Every scar and every experience will be etched in that wax, and as it hardens, and it takes years to harden, but as it hardens, those etchings and those wounds and those scars will remain forever trapped inside that wax. So when we have experiences of that nature, and none of us have not been children once. Maybe some of our childhoods have been aborted due to circumstances and trauma and so on, but we were all children, whether you believe it or not. And we are our parents' children, for good or for bad. As they say, our mother's daughters and our father's sons, or our mother's father's daughters, we both have fathers and mothers. And that has had deep impact on all our lives. And again, for good and for bad. It has deep impact in many powerful things that we experience, and there's also deep impact in areas that we have great challenges. Where did you see love for the first time in your life? Your parents. How they loved each other, or how they didn't love each other, or how they loved each other in a distorted way or in a love-hate way. Whatever happened had an impact on us. So there's no one here that is immune from these forces. And then the rest is, I don't want to say the rest is history, but then the rest is either fighting or having to contend with forces that we had no control over. Because we didn't decide what kind of parents to have, and we didn't decide how they're going to behave, and we didn't decide what kind of schools they would send us to, and all the attitudes that they would project and impose upon us. This is in addition to the genetic that I mentioned. So if you take all this into account, and you don't have to be a cynic or a skeptic to come to the conclusion that it's not a simple question, can a person change? Yeah, you can change something that happened yesterday, you can change today. You can change your garments. But can you change personality features? Especially ones that run in a family, nature, nurture. Some psychologists point out that enough nurture turns it into nature, which is actually an expression in the Middle-aged sages used the expression, hergel nasa teva. Habits become nature. And sometimes it says, hergel nasa teva sheni. Habits become a second nature. It's okay, there's first nature, there's second nature, third nature, kinds of levels. So the question about whether a person can change, you meet a person, and I'm sure nobody in this room, let's say you come to, some people are born stingy. And I'm not mentioning names, so it's not Lashon Hara, right? Open up a group on Facebook, stingy people. And we'll see how many people join. Because stingy people don't think they're stingy, of course. They think they're prudent. So open up a group, prudent people. That's what you should call it. And then you see that sometimes it runs in a family. Whether it runs in a family because the people imposed it upon themselves, or it's because genetic, we may never know. The question is, can such a thing be controlled? And then, of course, there's the other extreme. There are people who are extremely giving, sometimes to their own detriment. They hurt themselves and hurt others, giving without any discipline. I mean, I'm just giving two examples. There are thousands of examples. And all these come down to, can we change? So, that's the theme of this evening. And the reason I chose this theme is precisely because we are now in a period, and this is always an underlying focus of this class, to bring alive and make things personally relevant in the psychological, personal, spiritual realm of sometimes things that seem to be archaic traditions or rigid dogma. So there's a thing called the counting of the Omer, which is a mitzvah that goes back to the times of Moses, that when the Jews left Egypt, they counted 49 days, starting from the second night of Passover, the day they left, to 49 days later when they arrived at Mount Sinai, and on the 50th day was the Sinai revelation, the mandate, the divine mandate that was given to the Jewish people, to the human race, of how to live our lives. So they counted, as the Ran, one of the great commentators on the Talmud, says, they counted out of great anticipation. Ga'aguim, yearning. Something special is happening, you count down. You used to count down. And they counted every day, one more day, another day, until they reached that point. But there's another part of counting the Omer, which is why it's called Omer. So you're familiar with the book I did on the Omer book, which actually was an outgrowth of this Wednesday night to get together. I'll explain in a moment how. So we know that the Torah actually refers to this period of counting. And that is, the reference of the Torah is the context of that on the second day of Passover, or the Sememachas HaPesach, the second day of when you bring an offering, the wave offering, the Omer offering, you shall count 49 days until Shavuos, when another offering will be brought. So this is what the Torah says in the book of Leviticus and Pasha Omer, V'sfatim lechem and Machras HaShabbos, you shall count Machras HaShabbos Sheva Shavuos, 7 weeks, 49 days. 7 times 7, 7 days, 7 weeks. 7 times 7 equals 49. Okay, so those are the 49 days. Now this is a tradition, like many traditions, usually clouded in obscurity of what its significance is. So yes, on a legal level and on a biblical level, we understand its significance. But its personal significance, you can chalk up to so many other laws, and especially in the book of Leviticus, that seemingly are not relevant to contemporary times. The whole book of Vayikra, third book of the Torah, Leviticus, that we're reading now, is mostly all laws. The other books consist of stories, episodes, beginning from Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, stories of Noah and the flood, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, even the beginning of Exodus, the exile in Exodus, the book of Exodus is all about the exile and the Exodus in Egypt. the freedom, the parting of the sea, Sinai, the building of the temple. That's the first two books in a nutshell. But then comes book number 3, which is almost primarily halachas. As the Talmud says, it's the third and the hardest book because it's all legalities. And most of these halachas, most of these laws are actually not laws that are even practical in our time, because without a temple, you don't have the laws of the offerings in the literal sense. You don't have the laws of purity and impurity. And you don't have many of the laws related to the Kohanim, to the priests, that are outlined in this book. Then the Torah continues, since I'm already on it, it continues in the next book, the 4th book of Bamidbar, of Numbers. So after the 3rd chapter, it continues the journey that was concluded at the book of Exodus, the journey through the wilderness. That will end up through book 4, and then book 5 will be Moses repeating everything that had transpired in the 40th year when they arrived at the river Jordan right before they entered the promised land. So Leviticus stands out from all the 5 books as one that is almost completely focused on laws. And as I said, most of those laws are really not practical today in the relevant sense, in the action sense. So if anyone has a question about the relevance of Judaism, it's the 3rd book that is the most questionable. And as a matter of fact, a big impetus, so to speak, of the birth of the Reform movement after Mendelssohn died, and his students like Geiger and others, not the composer, no, Moses, not Felix. Moses Mendelssohn, I think he was related. Moses Mendelssohn in Germany. So his students write very blatantly that especially the book of Leviticus is absolutely irrelevant, and they cut it out from their view of what Judaism is about. So all of ritual is a question to anyone that's a spiritual seeker and trying to intelligently understand why would we be growing a beard today? Why do we sit at a Seder and don't eat any bread and only matzah? Why these others, hundreds of these rituals or mitzvahs and details to the point of almost obsession of doing things and not doing other things? So if you accept a mechanical approach to life and you grew up with it and you're programmed to be that way, as I said earlier, children are their parents' children, so you just go with the program, as they say, that's one thing. But most people who think and question will wonder at some point, what is it all about? Is it all just some type of blind rituals? And of course, in our time, these questions are all over. Because the fact is that most Jews today did not grow up in such programmed homes. So wherever you have grown up, these questions are very relevant. And the interesting thing is, as I came to discover myself when I began my own journey, was that these questions not only are acceptable, as opposed to what many will say, you're not allowed to ask them because they're sacrilegious and they're challenging so-called authority and all of that. Not only are they acceptable, this is the whole point of Judaism, is to ask these questions and to explore, but to wait to get the answer as well. Fortunately, many of my teachers didn't have the answers, and I'm sure some of yours didn't either, which is what rendered Judaism into, for many, a type of stereotype. Woody Allen captures it well in all his films. And the stereotype of a brainless, hollow, guilt-driven, neurotic Jew, and who struggles because there's always that battle between good and evil. But bottom line is, there's not much to value in these rituals. However, the fact of the matter is that, like everything in this world, there's a body and there's a soul. And it's true that if you've only been exposed to the body of it, it can seem quite irrelevant. But there's also a soul. And the soul of it, that sounds like Felix Mendelssohn or something, right? Yeah. The sounds today, the sights and sounds of our time. Relax. There's nothing sacrilegious in this room, that I can tell you. We've made sure. So with that being said, when it comes to a thing like the Omer counting, that too can be a very seemingly out-of-touch type of tradition. And due to this, as a result of that, I find it most compelling and most important to dispel this myth that in fact all these rituals and all these biblical stories, even the ones that seem to be not practical today, have profound spiritual meaning. You just have to dig a little, and you have to study what's called the other side of the Torah, which is the inner part. It's called the Pnimius HaTorah. There's the inner dimension. And without it, you frankly cannot really understand the relevance of most of Judaism. And I say most because obviously there are stories in the Bible. Just the literal story of the Bible, of the Garden of Eden and the battle of good and evil is relevant, even without any interpretation. But the fact is, the entire book of all the books of the Torah, and every detail, is all about the story of your life and my life. And the things you struggle with right now in your life, psychologically and emotionally and personally, are struggles that are documented in detail. So I would say that if you can find a book that discusses you and me and everything that we struggle with, it would be quite a waste to not look at this treasure of what was documented about people who had similar struggles like we do today, and what they did about it in their time. Obviously, we still have to apply it to our personal situation, but there is a formula, and a formula that clearly has worked. Judaism is still here after 4,000 years. If it was just a bunch of hollow traditions, how would it last? Jews are pretty smart people. The skeptics of 3,000 years ago would have already destroyed it. You have to wait for the brilliance of the 20th century or the Enlightenment or something like that. So clearly they knew something that many of us do not. And for focus this week, being that it's the Omer counting, so around 15 years ago, maybe even more, I would say even more than that, I spoke about it one week, and I mentioned that the Omer counting, the 7 times 7, 49 days, refers to the refinement of the personality, refinement of our emotions. Why? Because in Kabbalah and mysticism, the human psyche, the emotional structure of each of us, is made up of 7 components. Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Chayid, Yesod, Malchus, which in English briefly means love, discipline, compassion, fortitude, endurance or ambition, humility, bonding, and dignity. And that's in the books that I see some of you have right here. You could see it in more detail. And these 7 themselves consist of another 7, meaning each one of them has 7 within the 7. So, for example, love needs the discipline of love, the compassion of love, the endurance of love. So there you have, in effect, 49 so-called steps in understanding your own inner emotional structure. Now, with that being said, when I said it at the class, so everybody was very intrigued, they asked me, what are they? So I know that I grew up, and every night when you count the Omer, so you actually make a blessing, and you count the day, night of that night, and then in the prayer that follows, we say that we say a sphera. We say what is this night's feature: love of love, gvura shebechesed, discipline of love, etc. So each night has its own particular feature, and then we even say at the end of the prayer that may this feature within us and within the cosmos be refined and elevated, and so on. So I went back to my own Hebrew roots and to look at these and come back next week to the class to give an answer of what exactly are these 49 steps. And lo and behold, though I grew up with it and I counted it all my life, I could not figure them out myself. I said it was lip service, to be honest. So I confess here, even though confession is not necessarily a Jewish custom, but a certain vidui, I guess, a confession. So that I actually went and I could figure out a few of them, but all 49. So I went to so-called scholars in my world, people who I could access, and there were quite a few people that I called, and they were as ignorant as I was, which really was very impressive. So it reminded me when I was a child, and sometimes I would ask my father or a teacher a question, and when there was usually one of the answers I usually got, and I'm sure many did in the yeshiva, was when you get older, you'll understand. Or in Yiddish they say, just Elteven, Mr. Verstehen. So I got older, and I came to understand that they didn't understand, and that's why they gave me the answer. So of course you wonder how many teachers have been saying this, for how long? Is that what Moses said? I doubt it. As I said, it wouldn't have lasted if that was the answer given for so many years. You can only fool that some of the people all the time, right? What is the saying? Anyway, so I called many scholars, and I realized, not because of anything, it's just the fact that no one really researched it. So I was embarrassed to come back to the next week's class and say, I don't know. Not embarrassed, I would say, I have no problem saying I don't know something, but I did come back and I say, I'll be honest, I could share with you some of them, but I have to research the rest, and it's going to take a little time. And I began researching it, and I was very motivated because I was challenged by people who said, listen, you're saying it's all so relevant, show us. So that challenge, which came from the alumni of this class, some of you sitting here, I don't know if Philip remembers that time, and I actually researched it week after week, and I discovered, without having to create anything new, brilliant psychological insights for each of the 49. It wasn't in any way, it was not collected or gathered in any one book. It was pieces here and there, as much of the Torah is. Torah is usually not encyclopedic in that sense. Today we have maybe the tools and the technology to do that. But at least then, talking about then, I'm not talking about 2 centuries ago. I'm not that old. I'm talking about 20 years ago, 25 years ago. So I literally, at each class, I gave a handout here of that week's midah, that week's emotion, and went through each one of the 7. And that became the Omer book as you see it. As a matter of fact, it wasn't even my idea to do the book. There was someone here at the class and said, maybe I'll put it together, I'll design something. In those days, okay, go ahead, fine, so be it. That was it. And I never even planned or expected that it would be popular, and it became hugely popular. It wasn't even planned at all. It came literally out of a need and out of a demand, actually, of people looking to find the relevance. And when you look at it, and though, yes, I can take credit for creating it, but I didn't create the ideas, they come from that timeless structure called the Sfirot. Or specifically, we're talking about the 7 emotional spheres, the 7 emotional dimensions. And it is all about personal refinement. The word zichuch hamidus is an expression. Refining your emotions, refining your personality. To the point that, I've been surprised more than once. A few years ago, a guy called me, or I think emailed me, from Salt Lake City, a psychiatrist, and he uses this book with a group in a rehab. He works in a rehab in Salt Lake City. Nothing to do with Judaism. And he uses this book as required exercises for anyone that joins the program there. Not the optional. They have to actually go through this book and do each exercise and come back with a report of what they discovered and what they did and how could they, where their strengths are, where their weaknesses are. So it's fascinating to me, obviously, but it just confirms that mystical insights that sometimes sound so cryptic when you don't know how to translate it have unbelievable relevance to our time, which is a psychological time. Psychology is very in, so to speak. The self-awareness, therapy, whatever the reason is, it's one of the hot studies, I guess. Maybe it's because we're a dysfunctional age, so we're desperate to try to figure out what we're like. When people were more functional, maybe they didn't even call it psychology. They just called it issues, whatever. And so in that context, to go back to the theme, I thought it's important to discuss really the basis of it all. And the basis of it all is, can we change a personality? As I go back to what I said earlier. If we're all wired a certain way, how can we expect certain changes? And if you look around in nature, nature confirms that. Nature does not change. Only human beings can disrupt the flow of nature. Yes, there can be things that evolve, perfect themselves, but animals will be animals. What I mean by that is, they're like a clock. Animals will behave a certain way. They're the predators and they're the prey, and there's a balance. The balance is a fascinating balance. Today we see it with cameras that can be brought to places that we once were not able to ever even know. We see it in underwater. We see it on land. It's all about a certain precision like a clock, and you can predict it like a clock. So if we are all human beings, part of that world, one could argue that we too are like that way. Yet we see human beings, of course, can digress, and we definitely can do damage. The question is, can we also improve the system? So, of course, the rule goes that if you can damage it, you can go out of the script one way, why can't you go out of the script the other way? And that is what I'm going to address here. That there's no question that there's a part of us that is somewhat subject to the clockwork of nature. But there's a part of us that's not. And the question is, can we bridge these two worlds? Which is really understanding and dissecting the anatomy of the soul. But you see, the thing is, when you talk about a soul and spirituality in general, often it's talked about in such general terms that it's very difficult to get a handle on it. For instance, if you imagine you're, God forbid, you're not feeling good, so you have a pain, or you have difficulty breathing, and not anyone here, just theoretically. So to just say, listen, I don't feel good, obviously is not going to get you anywhere. You have to describe where, what part of your body, what symptoms. And that's what a doctor will ask you. Once they hear the symptoms, you isolate it to a particular area. And then that area itself, of course, we know there are also another infinite possibilities. But there's a certain process of elimination, and you get into the details. Without getting into the details, there's no way that a person is going to heal. When it comes to the soul, however, because we don't have the same so-called elaborate medical journals and elaborate research, or maybe the demand isn't there as it is in physical health, we don't have quite the same type of map. The human body has been mapped out in detail. We have x-rays, we have CAT scans. Even with all the maps, there's still mysteries upon mysteries in this small little body. 5-6 foot frame, 100, 200 few pounds, etc. Let's stick to that number. And still there are mysteries with all that we have discovered, and with all medical advancements. Just look at the brain, the size of your palm, and its complexities. And even if you figure out one brain, which no one has ever done, every one of us has a different brain, and how the brain works. When it comes to the soul, however, even that hasn't been mapped. Even the basics. Like when someone will say to you, I think you have a soul? I have a soul, yeah. Well, tell me, what is your soul like? What does it look like? Is it made up of pieces? In the good old mystical school of thought, they would say this cat is a reincarnation of someone who missed a Torah class. Where did it come from? What is that? No. Still here? Oh, wow. That's a first. Okay. We don't discriminate against cats. Looks like it's going to be an interesting night. So watch out. If you don't behave, you can end up reincarnating in a cat. Maybe it's not so bad. Can you upgrade, right? Huh? It's a good question, but let's stick to the theme here. I know it's very interesting, reincarnation, but so did we catch it on camera? Okay. So when you talk about the soul, so here you have in the Omer counting a map of the soul. Just for the record, even though we're not discussing that part, this is only the 7 emotions. In truth, the full conscious psyche, its structure is based on 10 steps, and hence the 10 sfirot. So in addition to the 7 that I mentioned, add 3 intellectual or cognitive faculties, Chochmah, Bina, Das, which is usually translated as wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. But most people don't know what the difference between those 3 are. So concept, when you have a spark of an idea, it's like a concept, that's a chachma. Bina is embellishing and developing the idea, fleshing it out. And das is like the conclusion, where you say like, aha, I got it, type of a full picture. And like you'll find people who are excellent, we call them chachamim, or chachamot. That's a person who's great at conceiving ideas. You'll find that there are people who are great at conceiving ideas. Other people are great at taking an idea and developing it. And usually people are good at one and not so good necessarily at the other. So you can see these are completely two different cognitive skills. Some people are great at conceiving. Others are great at taking the concept and breaking it into detail, getting it down, how to implement it, etc., etc. So that just adds that. But just for the full equation, that's just the conscious faculties. The Kabbalah continues and talks about the unconscious faculties, which again is not the theme of this discussion here. Somewhat a bit, as you'll soon see. And that's what we call the world of Keser, the crown, that goes above Chachma, the world of the crown, which itself breaks into two parts, Atikim and Archampin, the unconscious mind, the mind, the intellect that's beyond intellect, all kinds of interesting names. And I will address them at other classes, so don't feel that we won't get there. But I just wanted to give the full spectrum. So when you want a map of the soul, that's exactly what mysticism, Jewish mysticism does, beginning from the book of, the classic book, the Zohar itself. Before that, even the book of Yetzirah, the book of formation, attributed to Abraham. And definitely in the later Kabbalists, like the Arizal, and the more contemporary ones that turned it into a language that we can relate to. But it is fundamentally a psychological, psycho-spiritual map of your soul and my soul. And no different than a medical expert would give you an X-ray. There is an X-ray, a so-called X-ray, not physical X-ray, a spiritual X-ray of a soul. Why is this so vital? Because number one, just as I mentioned before with physical maladies, Maimonides writes, there's cheli haguf and cheli hanefesh. There are physical maladies and there are spiritual ones, or psychological ones, if you wish, mental ones, emotional ones. So just like healing is required, to heal requires focus on details. You can't just say, I don't feel good. The same is true on the spiritual, psychological level. What area? You can't just say, I'm psychologically weak, or I have psychological pain, or existential loneliness. There are areas, there is a breakdown here. And you'll be surprised to find out that sometimes, some areas that you feel very weakened, but there are other areas that you're very strong in. You may not even be aware of it. Now, can a person truly heal on any level, physical or psychological, without the awareness of what the weakness is and what the strength is? Firstly, you need the strengths to access them in order to help you in this battle. And secondly, you need to isolate the weakness and not just imagine that it's spilled over, that all of you is weak. Which really is one of the big challenges anytime you deal with someone who feels that they're damaged goods, so to speak. That I grew up in an environment that damaged me, abusive environment. And the word is used, the damaged goods. I feel I'm worthless. I feel like I'm not worthy of love. I don't deserve anything in life. That statement itself tells you the person is completely consumed with something that happened to them. I'm not judging the person, because abuse, especially at a young age, can do that, can completely demoralize and destroy any self-confidence. But the fact is, on a purely empirical level, it's one area that may have been hurt. This does not mean that all of you has become damaged. But to convince someone of that is not an intellectual journey, it's an emotional one. That's the problem. If you emotionally feel weak, you lose confidence, then you can't fight on. I mean, you hear this even in the areas that are not so psychological, like even in athletics and sports, or in other areas of expertise, there's a thing of loss of confidence. People who've been trained and have excelled, they can have a loss of confidence. And that doesn't allow them to access their own strengths. And it is sometimes mind games. It can be other things that come and get in the way. It can be other areas of your life that are affecting you and you can't concentrate. And this is a common thing. And even in the healthy circumstances, there's a thing of being in the zone and not being in the zone. Anyone that's a writer or an artist can tell you, you can't always control it. It's not like you can press a button and you're in the zone. There may be methods that if you do so and so and so, often it brings you there, but no guarantee. And sometimes it's just not, and sometimes it happens out of the blue. These are part of the whole process that's all relevant to understanding ourselves. So it's easy to make a statement as King Solomon actually made. He made the statement, very depressing statement, in the book of Ecclesiastes, Kehelas. He says, Der Chelach v'der ba. A generation comes and a generation goes. Ve'ein kol chodesh tachas hashemesh. And there's nothing new under the sun. And if you just need a little more depressing statements, read on, where he says, all the rivers flow to the sea, and it never gets full. So when you read it literally, it sounds like an older man, depressed about life, resigned. And, like generations come, every generation thinks, you're young and idealistic, we're going to do something unique. And then you find out that they thought of like that over thousands of years, and everything ends up the same way. This is, of course, the classic resignation of about life, that there's nothing really that can be done to change things. But when you read Kehelas exactly more intently, and especially with the deeper meaning between the lines, it's interesting. King Solomon says the following: a generation comes and a generation goes, and there's nothing new. Tachas hashemesh, under the sun. Why do you use the expression under the sun? He should have said there's nothing new in existence, or there's nothing new, period. So here is where some of the commentaries explain, under the sun there's nothing new. But there's a very big area above the sun. Now this doesn't mean literally above the sun in the sense, it means that there are two dimensions to life, and we write our script. If you bind yourself, and you, to the so-called trappings of the forces that have shaped you, including our parents' home, and even genetics, then yes, you have written your own story, and then will be, or the story will be one of nothing can really be changed. But if you can access a part inside of your spirit or soul that is above the sun, that's beyond the structure, and you can learn to channel it into your life, then everything is new. That's why you find two types of people. We see it all the time. There are people, of course, the less common, the road less traveled, who have always a certain dimension of exuberance. They're excited. They wake up, jump out of bed with a certain enthusiasm. So I know most people will say, they must be very young, or they've never been disappointed. That's usually what you hear when say. No, but I'll show you some people who are not so young, and have been deeply disappointed, and have really seen the darkness of life, and they still have it. The spark, the spunk. And then there are people who actually do not see so much darkness and pretty good lives of entitlement, and don't have that. Wake up depressed, have nothing to look forward to. And even when once in a while there's something, it doesn't last very long. So what's the difference between these two people? So often most people say, well, there's circumstances. It's not correct. There are people, as I said, born in homes and environments where they had everything they needed. And that does not at all guarantee happiness. As a matter of fact, some say it guarantees the opposite, because they haven't earned it. And when a human being hasn't earned it internally, no matter what kind of game you show and how the veneer that you put on, the Yerushalmi said it long ago, the Talmud. There's a thing called nema d'chsufa. It means the bread of shame. It's the bread that you get that you didn't earn, that someone gave you. So yes, there's a certain sense of entitlement, and you think you're special and better, and blah, blah. But there's a part of your soul, a part of your psyche, knows you never did a thing to get it. And now you may even ignore that voice, but it's still there. And it cannot be a force that gives you confidence. It is the people that have earned their way that build a confidence within. They know they can make it. They know the next challenge. Just like I earned my keep yesterday, I can earn it again. Those that have never earned it, or barely earned it, are always guessing, could I really make it if I had to do it on my own? As I said, it may not even be a conscious voice, but somewhere inside the psyche lurks a voice like that. So in discussing this whole idea about whether we can change or not, it's much deeper than just a technical question. Yes, you can change, you can't change. Look, the fact is we all need to eat. We all need to sleep. We have other needs. You can't change that. That's true. But that's a very, very superficial perspective. But you talk about personality, and you talk about emotions, that this 49-day period tells us unequivocally that absolutely it's in your power. That you can refine, you can change, you can channel, and you can absolutely improve who you are as a human being. And it's not a pre-written script, and you're not doomed one way or the other. It's up to you. Which, of course, itself, the statement itself is vital in giving a person the confidence, but you have to believe in it. If you don't believe in it, obviously, no matter what is said, you won't be ready to forge ahead. But to do so requires a dissecting of the emotions. There's no way a person can work on themselves in any way if they don't break it down into pieces. As I said earlier with the physical body, the same is with the spirit and the psyche. It has to be divide and conquer, so to speak. You can't just say, I don't feel good, or I'm not happy. You have to isolate and determine what are the areas that you're weak in, what are the areas you're strong in. It's the only way that a person can grow, and more importantly, a person can have a self-awareness. Self-awareness itself is a journey. Most of us don't like to hear that we're not self-aware, but the fact of the matter is most people are not very self-aware. Biggest reason for that is because we're subjective, and subjectivity blinds the eyes of the wise and distorts our perspective of ourselves and on how others see us. And it takes actually a brutal honesty that is not so comfortable to be able to actually look at yourself in a different way. Where do you think most people finally really reach some deeper introspection? Unfortunately, it's when they suffer, when their comfort zones or their the things they felt they relied on so much didn't work. And suddenly you're forced to look at yourself in a new way. Not something anybody invites, or anybody wants or welcomes. It's usually forced upon you by others or by circumstances. However, the counting of the Omer was not such a period. Here, the Jewish people, as they came out of Egypt, took upon themselves. They knew they're coming to some major experience, and they imposed upon themselves the need for such introspection. So when we're in this period of time, it's all about looking at those details. So how do we explain the idea that on one hand we are structures that don't seem changeable, just like you can't change the color of your eyes, you can't change other features. I don't mean cosmetically or with surgery, I mean fundamentally. So how can we expect to change personality features? So let me explain how that's possible. And maybe the way to do so is a little science. There was a French philosopher, scientist, in the 19th century. His name was Laplace, Laplaca, I believe. Being that I don't speak French, I don't know if I pronounced it with the right French twinge, but you can look it up. You can Google it. And he wrote and made this famous statement that if you would give him all the data on any given individual or any given circumstance, all the data, he can predict what will happen with this individual or the circumstance till the end of time. The only problem is we don't have all the data, which seemed to make a lot of sense. It's scientifically definitely so. That if you have all the information about something, and you can then manipulate it and put it under all circumstances and figure out how would it behave under the cold, under the heat, what would happen in 100 years and 200 years and 1,000 years, etc. But you need the data. Without the data, if you're missing some data, there's always an X variable that you may not know, so you can't make any predictions. Now, when he came out with this statement, obviously the religious world was very disturbed, because essentially he was eliminating the whole concept of free will. Free will meaning that a human being can actually make a choice. If it's all just a program and we just have ignorance, we don't know what will be the choice. That doesn't mean there's choice. It just means that you don't know, but it's all driven by forces that are not in our control. So this was a debate. It wasn't anything new. Religion and science were debating things already for 100, 200 years before him. But it just added another so-called nail in the coffin of religion, or at least this version of religion. So yes, there's Isaac Bashevis Singer's version of free will. He puts it this way: we must believe in free will. We have no choice. It's classic Jewish thinking. Explain that one. But he wasn't a mystic; he was a novelist. So this is Laplace. Now, what happened in the subsequently was a fascinating thing. Not religion, but science itself upset Laplace's theory from beginning to end. And in all fields of science, mathematics, physics, and even science itself, the philosophy of science. Just briefly, and you'll see in a moment why this is relevant, because obviously it reflects on our psyches too. Because if he was right, then each of us has a very complex program, but a program that determines what you're going to do today and tomorrow, and why you're going to walk down this street and not that one, and why some of us like chocolate and some vanilla, and why some will make moral choices this way and some will make moral choices another way. So, of course, it has very fundamental significance to our personal lives, and responsibility, and expectations of each other. So science in all those fields, and I'll start with the most famous maybe, and this is not a class in science, but it's very, very fascinating, the parallels between physics, science, and mysticism in this sense. And you'll see how it literally parallels Kabbalistic thought that was always known, which was the basis of where free will came from in the first place. As I said, the ability to go above the sun, not under the sun. So under the sun, there is a structure, and there are predictions that can be made. But then, in quantum mechanics, in the 20s, 1920, in Berlin and cities in Europe, began the discoveries of what they call quantum mechanics, quantum physics. And it's based on many different principles, but one that stands out and has become somewhat popular in popular culture, the famous Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which briefly, without getting into the whole complexity of it, states that fundamentally certain things in the quantum world, which means in the subatomic world, fundamentally, not due to lack of data, fundamentally are unknowable and uncertain. Or as Niels Bohr put it, probability. They're in states of probability. You know, this has been made famous in books and in plays. There's a play, Copenhagen, a few years ago in New York, other places in the world. Copenhagen theory, Copenhagen interpretation of the quantum mechanics, Schrodinger's cat, all these ideas are all relevant to this. And essentially it states, as I said, the principle that you can never know the position and the velocity, the momentum of a subatomic particle at the same time. And as soon as you know one, the other becomes fundamentally unknown. And this has real consequences, very weird consequences, and bizarre ones, that actually made it possible to create the microchip, which never could have been predicted, that in so little space you'd have so much power. It's built on manipulation of subatomic particles. Our computers today and our cellular technology are built on that. There was a book recently that said the most certain things in life are built on an uncertainty principle. A computer is the most certain thing. A computer equation will never make a mistake. I'm not talking about there's a weak battery or something. And if the data is put in right, it will always give you the same result. And that's built on uncertainty principle. The same idea was stated by Karl Popper about science in general, where he said that science was always assumed to be an absolute type of principles. And he said the whole basis of science is based on scientific theory. And scientific theory states the following, that for anything to be true in science, it has to be able to be disproven. Not just proven, disproven as well. Because if you can't disprove it, you can't prove it, or vice versa. So he explains that if someone says, for instance, God exists, it's not a scientific statement, because you can't disprove it. You can't disprove that God exists. Even the great radical atheists of our time do not say they know absolutely. They say they're almost as sure as they don't believe in elves and fairy tales. But absolute disproof, you can't absolutely disprove something because you can't absolutely prove it with logic and so on. And finally, the great mathematician, maybe the greatest of all time, Gödel, said the same thing about mathematics, which is maybe the most surprising of all, because mathematics is considered to be the most absolute of sciences. And he says that, as opposed to what everyone thought, that mathematics is based on absolute logical axioms, he said it is not. The axioms of fundamental mathematics are not logical, which means they're accepted universally by us in order to have a logical system. But that acceptance is not necessarily a logical one. Anyway, I don't want to go into more detail. You can look it up yourself. But based on these observations, that defied, they are counterintuitive, they were argued about, they still are argued about, but they've been proven too many times in a laboratory to be taken not seriously. Yes, and there have been mystics who have written books paralleling quantum mechanics with mysticism, especially Far Eastern. Some of you may know the book Tao of Physics from Fridtjof Capra, who was an American physicist, changed his name. Many that make these parallels. But especially if you're familiar with Kabbalistic thought and ideas, this concept was always known. It wasn't known in the scientific sense, but it was always known that there's a structure to existence. And I'm using now Kabbalistic terminology. I'm translating it. And there's beyond the structure. And the structure is absolutely definable. Every time I would throw up something right now, it will always fall down the same way. Except if there's a wind or there's other circumstances. But I mean, taking the same situation, which is essentially the basis of Newtonian physics, like the billiard ball effect. You hit a billiard ball always this way, certain angle, it will always respond a certain way. Cause and effect. Completely predictable cause and effect, which is the basis, we would all argue, for all science. If you do this, this will be the result. Yet, on a quantum mechanics level, on a microscopic level, there's clearly an area of existence that it's not that way. You cannot make the statement that if you do this, there'll always be an effect. It's not correct. There will be different effects in different times, and you cannot predict it. So the Kabbalists say that there's a structure of existence that is defined and unwavering. The sun will rise every morning, and you can predict where it will rise, and you can know exactly when the moon will be full and when it will be half and when it will be a quarter moon and a new moon. And the same thing with all of nature's clockwork system. But there's a place, we call it in Kabbalistic terminology, Lamaila Meseder Shtalshlus. Above and higher than the cosmic structure. Hishtalshlus in Hebrew means like an evolution, a chain of steps. And there's this place which is above the chain and above the structure. And that too is very much part of our reality. It's not just somewhere on a divine dimension. It's inside of you and me and inside of existence. And if you can open up a door between the Lamaila Meseder Shtalshlus and Hishtalshlus, you can cause and activate change even in the structural level. Now in science, this is a common practice. As I said, think of a nuclear reaction. What do you think it is? There are subatomic particles in a strand of hair. You would never imagine how many. No one even knows how many. Because it doesn't occupy space as we understand. But once upon, you'd never think a strand of hair, how much energy can it have? You throw it in a fire, in a second it won't give off any light, warmth, or energy. Yet they discovered that manipulating subatomic particles releases an energy that's more powerful than the largest physical cosmic reactions that are visible to us. How do you explain that? How do you explain something that has no quantity has such power? It would have been completely seen as an irrational religious fanatic saying something like that 300 years ago, 200 years ago. Power was in size, in quantity, firepower. That the invisible should be able to yield such potency was impossible to understand. Today, it's not just existent on a subatomic level, it's also in the human body, God forbid. One mutant cell among 75 trillion cells in the human body. Trillion, by the way. We're getting there with the economy, but it's a pretty big number. 75 trillion cells, one mutant cell, God forbid, will wreak havoc in the worst possible way. One extra chromosome is what Down syndrome is about. Extra, not even missing, extra. Now today this is not surprising when you think about it, because we become accustomed to the invisible. And we know that in a program, let's say a computer program of millions of lines of programming, add a dot, take out a dot, and the whole program will not work. One dot? Someone will say, what's one dot compared to these millions and millions of code? That's how it is. So the concept of bridging two worlds, one world that is to us seemingly invisible, we cannot witness it, we cannot analyze it directly, at least, and even instruments, there are no instruments that measure subatomic particles, yet its effect on our lives is measurable. So it's almost like a door opening up from a world that is unknown, and when that door opens up, it can change the reality of what we know. And this essentially, in one sentence, is modern technology. That once time and space separated us, now you can sit here and watch something 1,000,000 miles away. Simultaneous. So to us, we take it for granted, but explain it. Time and space are real divisions. It'll take you years to travel that many millions of miles. And yet it can be broadcast instantaneously. What's being broadcast? Exactly what's happening there. So yes, it can be explained and there's this, but the bottom line, it comes down to that there's some type of integral unifying forces that connects us all, that transcends time and space. And technology now is learning to tap into it. So when it comes to things like love, we know love, time and space do not weaken love. You can sit right next to somebody and hate their guts, and you could be 1,000,000 miles away from somebody and love them as if they're one with you. But that's love. We haven't seen that now, we see it also in a physical sense. So go back now to our personalities and the basis of counting the Omer. What it means is essentially this. You have a soul inside of you. There's a structured part of the soul that clearly has personality. And that personality is shaped by genetics, by childhood experiences, and even later in life. Different experiences shape us. There's no question. That's a real structure. It's a structure that can even be predictable. You know, people who have, for instance, bouts of rage, or fits of rage, whether it's because what they saw in their own home, or whatever it is that caused them to be that way, sometimes it's uncontrollable. People have told me, I can't control myself. I know it's wrong. I know I promise not to do it again, but I get angry, and I have these outbursts. And many of us have other type of emotional reactions to things. And even when you're aware, if you're not aware that it's no good, that's another story. But even when you're aware, what is it that stops you from just controlling it? It overwhelms you. And then there's, of course, the reaction the other way around. People just shut down, which doesn't have the same so-called dramatics and fireworks as a fit of rage or tears, but it's equally emotional. Except it inverts and implodes instead of exploding. It's another personality. So of course all these can be analyzed, how a person's that way, why they're that way, what influences cause them to be that way. But the real question is, can it change? That's the question. And if you can isolate it, as I said before, and see what part of the personality is it coming from, or let's put it more, what part of the spectrum of human emotions in the structure it comes from, that is the first step. And the second step is, and this is the vital thing to know, that there's another part in your soul that you may not have access, that is beyond the structure. And if you open up the faucet, so to speak, the channel, that part can come in, spill in to the area that is structured, and can actually so-called rewire yourself. You know, today we know there's a phenomenon, again, God forbid, I'm just using medical examples because they're real and undeniable. A person has, God forbid, a stroke. If it's caught in time, of course, it's one thing. But regardless, it is demonstrated, proven, that even if a part of a brain has been damaged, the nerves and the neurons will create their own, naturally, obviously it has to be caught in time and so on, will rewire themselves. They'll bypass the infected or the so-called numb area or the affected area, and create new channels, channels of neurons that connect the brain to the rest of through the spinal cord to the rest of the body. Nobody can explain why. There are organs in the body that will not regenerate. But there are parts of the body that will regenerate. How that works? It's similar to the idea of a tree, the roots of a tree. The roots will search for water. They have some intelligence to look for the water. And if they're blocked, it's been proven in the laboratory that when the roots are blocked from the water supply, they'll go around and around until they find it. I don't know if you know this, when the first man went to outer space, in the early 60s, was it John Glenn, whoever, and so it was the first time that human beings were in a world where there was no gravity, or almost no gravity. So they sent up all kinds of experiments to figure out, what it would be like up there, different circumstances. And one of the things they did was they sent a plant into outer space. And what happened was, the plant came back, when it came back to Earth, surprised everybody. Roots were growing in all directions. It was no longer a plant. There were roots growing from the top, from the bottom, because they had no sense of a center. There was no centrifugal force, in a sense like looking for water. There was nowhere to go. And on Earth, obviously, they have a sense of top, bottom, or where water may be, etc., etc. So the point is that the same is true. Some of you are familiar with the movie that was recently a phenomenon a few years ago, What the Bleep Do We Know? With emphasis on bleep, yeah. So, and this was, it was a little mystical, but they brought their psychiatrists and stuff like that, the perceptions of reality. And essentially, the concept that in Judaism been made popular by one of the Hasidic rabbis, Tzemach Tzedek, he said to a family who had a child that was very ill, and the doctors had given up hope, and he said in 5 words, he said, Trach gut wird sein gut. Think good and it will be good. Which you could say, okay, it's a nice little comforting statement, be positive, upbeat, don't be depressed. But it's actually much deeper than that. He said a statement, think good and you will create good. In other words, your thoughts can change the reality. So in this movie, which is on the websites and stuff like that, basically that's the principle there. Based on the certainty principle and other principles, that the idea is that the way your neurons are fired, that's how they get wired. A person who does not believe in himself or herself will ultimately not succeed. And this shouldn't be so surprising. Let's say you're in a mood that you're in a ambivalent state of mind. And you meet someone who's not just ambivalent, but also very negative. Of course it affects you. Someone who's very positive will also affect you. In other words, positive energy breeds positive energy, and negative energy breeds negative energy. This does not mean, obviously, that, God forbid, something happens to a person in an accident and they just think good, the accident goes away. But it means that new doors are open. I know this was made popular by the book The Secret, right? The Law of Attraction. Whether you like the book or you don't like the book, but the ideas go back more than thousands of years. So the point is that when it comes to ourselves, firstly, a person has to believe that change is possible. Secondly, they have to dissect themselves and isolate and define the specifics of where there's the strengths and where there's weaknesses. And third, they have to access the part that is beyond the structure within yourself. So you say, well, how do you access that dimension? Well, in Judaism, you have mitzvahs. Some of them deal with the structure of your being, and some of them deal with which is beyond your structure. For example, the mitzvah of simcha, the mitzvah of joy, is a mitzvah. It's not just a nice suggestion. It says, Ivdu es Hashem b'simcha, serve God with joy. Tachas asher lo yavadta Hashem elokecha b'simcha v'tuv levov. In the negative, joy, simcha, is considered to be an obligation. And not just on Purim and Simchas Torah, but all year round, 24/7. Toiv lev mishta tamid, which means a constant type of joy, constant type of celebration. Obviously in Purim, Simchas Torah, other times of the year, even personal times, the time of a personal simcha, personal celebration, and more intense joy. Sukkos, Zman Simchasenu. But joy is a constant, should be a constant. Now this itself is requires a good analysis of what that means. What happens if a person is not in the mood? They're not joyous. So the answer is, through joy you become in the mood. That's why there's the mitzvah. You don't always do things that you're in the mood of. But how do you act joyous when you're not joyous? And what is the meaning of joy? So there's an expression, Simcha Peiritz Geder. Joy breaks all boundaries. You see, when people are joyous, the regular, conventional boundaries that separate us usually melt away. And I'm talking about healthy people. Healthy persons in joy, they will forgive easier. They will invite people to their weddings or their celebrations with a much more open heart. Grudges melt away. In general, a lot of petty things disappear when a person is in that type of state of mind. Again, I'm talking about joy of a healthy person. An unhealthy person, a joyous occasion can be a selfish and very, very actually hurtful type of experience. Because they're not really being joyous, that's the truth. They're just having a joyous occasion. I was recently at a wedding like that. As soon as you walk in, and you know that the parents of the bride and the parents of the groom are not talking to each other, you can imagine that it spills down to the rest of the levels. So yes, you have the musicians playing music, but the mood, I guess maybe I was more sensitive than others, but you can tell, especially if you go to another type of celebration where there's joy from the top, there's joy all the way through. This is, you should know, if you host an event, it's always going to be determined by it's like the cog in a wheel. The top wheel turns properly, the rest of the wheels turn. Top wheel is shaky, everything will be compromised. So if you really want to know where you're at, you should host a party and invite me and I'll tell you. Because you could always tell. The guests you can't always know, but the hosts you always know, because they create the ambiance, the environment, and so on. So when it comes to joy is an example of a mitzvah that accesses the unconscious, beyond structure part of your soul. So when a person says, I'm not joyous, what you're really saying is my structure doesn't allow for any joy. I'm sad, I've been hurt, even if it's justifiable things. I'm not talking about just a person who's in a sour mood or is obstinate. But it's still your structure. And you should know you have something that's beyond your structure. And with joy, you break that door down. And sometimes that's what you need. Another way, interestingly, is like tshuva. I don't want to say sin, but it is coming from sin. There are people who are goody-goodies who always follow the rules, which is very nice. I had some people in my class like that. You can imagine from what I'm saying, I wasn't one of them. And then there's some people who break the rules. Now you'd think, okay, breaking rules is not such a good thing. But breaking rules sometimes opens up doors that someone who's following the rules can't open. That's not a justification, but after the fact, obviously. And that's why it says in the Talmud, if someone says, I will sin in order to do tshuva, that's not so acceptable. Because then that's manipulation. And you're using the sin, using the tshuva to get to do, that's not how it works. But if a person made a mistake, even if it was a intentional one, and later they learn through the experience, they can open up doors that someone who did not make the mistake cannot. The Baal Shem Tov story that I always like about this is there was a situation of a desperate situation. Someone was very sick, and they came begging the Baal Shem Tov to help out. The doctors had lost hope, and so he gathered together 10 tzaddikim. They called tzaddikim in this term, the hidden tzaddikim, and they prayed. They prayed and prayed and prayed, and to no avail. Not working. Then came, Baal Shem Tov sees it's not working, so he goes out to the forest, and he had a certain special corner where he knew, where the thieves would hang out, the den of thieves. And he comes, and they're all like surprised, what is he doing here? And he meets the head guy, and he says, they knew each other. And the Baal Shem Tov says, I need 10 of you. What do you need us? I need you to pray with me. Okay, fine. They took a break from their professions, and they went to pray. Did they work on Wall Street? Yeah, it could have been maybe. And they came to pray with the Baal Shem Tov, and what do you think happened? the child recovered. So afterwards, the surprised students of the Baal Shem Tov said, what exactly happened here? Why is it the big tzaddikim, their prayers didn't work, and these thieves, the prayers worked? So he said, very simple. He saw that all the gates in heaven were locked, and he needed someone to break in. So sometimes, especially when the rules of society are not that healthy in the first place, breaking rules can actually be a redemption. So revolution is all in its place. If it's in the wrong place, yeah, it can be disruptive, it can be destructive. But if it's in the right place, it opens up a channel that's beyond. Young people have energy. I remember when I was a teenager, and everybody would tell you, the disciplinarians and the authorities, your energy, they would maybe tolerate it, but it was always seen like a sin. Like, breaking rules, defiance, you're looking for your independence, whatever it is. And adults often had the attitude of, okay, you'll grow out of it, you'll soon become one of us, and then you give up on these big dreams, and then you're going to change everything. You're not changing anything. And I remember hearing, and this had a big impact on me. It was a definitive moment in my own so-called formative years. My 17 years old, 18 years old, and I still live with that till this day. And actually, the chapter in Torah Meaningful Life on youth captures this theme. And I heard it from the Rebbe himself. He said that the rebellion of young people, some people misunderstand, adults, that it's coming from an unhealthy place. You have to tolerate exactly that attitude. He says people like that, adults like that, should either get out of the way if they can't help. And the truth is that the rebellion in the spirit of a young person comes from the fire of the soul that refuses to conform to the status quo and wants to change the world but frustrated because it doesn't know how to. And it sees injustice or sees things that are flawed, hypocrisy, including adults and all this stuff, and wants to change it. So what would a true adult do is, a seasoned person, use your seasoning, your experience and knowledge to help channel the fire, instead of consuming, to be channeled into a spiritual revolution. That was the gist of it. And it was really, for me, to hear that was unbelievable, because I didn't hear it from another 17-year-old. Or I heard it from a 75-year-old Hasidic Rebbe, who you would not think would speak this language. And then I realized, if there were revolutionaries like that through the generations, all you need is one in every generation. That's enough for me. Whether it dresses up in traditional garb is meaningless. That's the spirit. And then that's what I learned was Abraham, and that was Moses. These were not conformists. You're talking about people that defied their entire generation. Even their Jewish brethren they defied. Moses was not popular at all with the establishment, the Jewish establishment in his time. And in Abraham there was no Jewish establishment, but there was other establishments. They were never popular. That's what made them visionaries and leaders. And they weren't the second. When someone else jumped, they'll jump after them. They jumped based on a deep internal confidence and connection to their own souls. They accessed what Hasidus and Kabbalah would call the world that's L'mayla Meseder Shtalshlus, the world of the Ein Sof. You hear sometimes the light of the Ein Sof, the infinite light. What does it really mean, the infinite light? And then you hear of the finite light. The infinite light is the light in your soul that has no limitations. Everything is possible there. And then it has to contend with the finite light in your soul, which begins to conform to the structures around you. Newborn children, the infinite light is shining. They get younger, everything is possible. Now we see it as almost like naive, foolish, don't know the real ways of the world. Well, the Kabbalah and Judaism sees it as the infinite light in full glory before it's been compromised and contaminated by adult perspectives. The real challenge is, can we combine the two worlds? Can that infinite possibility world manifest in the finite world and change it? And that's the revolutionaries of history. We're able to bridge the two. And in our own creativity, frankly, true creativity is someone that opens the channel almost from the unconscious into the conscious. And that's when you have brilliance, whether it's in music or in art or in literature or in just human expression or in love, for that matter. Unfortunately, we often buy into the script that we've convinced ourselves, others have convinced us, like the blind leading the blind, that we are bound to our structures. If Judaism comes to teach anything, and especially the inner dimension of it, is that it's not true. That's simply a myth. That's one dimension that's true. That's a structure that exists. But there's another dimension that is not at all limited by those limits. And you have the power to access it. To access it requires, as I said, the belief in it and the courage to travel there. So joy is one way. Tshuva is another way, which means if you broke the rules in an unhealthy way, figure out how to break the rules in a healthy way, so to speak. Learn new paths. Learn new paths. And a third way is what's called faith. That's exactly why in Judaism there's a thing called amunah and there's a thing called reason, faith and reason. It's not what people think. Reason is the dominant tool in our lives. And when all reason fails, okay, in absence of reason, we have nothing else but faith. That's a myth. Faith is a true faculty. As a matter of fact, faith touches the places of reality that reason can never enter. You tell me, is love based on faith or based on reason? If it was based on reason, we wouldn't be making so many mistakes. The healthiest forms of love, the healthiest passion. The word passion doesn't make sense in the world of reason, by the way. Reason will always say everything should be tempered. You have to always minimize the risks. That's what reason should always say. Where would a person let go completely? Only because there's something inside of you that says, I'm ready to go all the way. Love is real healthy love is infinite light. It's not finite light. You tell me a love that's finite, what does finite mean? When does it stop? When you get uncomfortable? Would that be called true love? Yes, I understand we want to be safe, so we make our conditional love. Like a guy told me, I have unconditional love for her. If she does what I want, I'll always love her. Unconditional. Unconditional based on the condition. So unconditional love, not so easy to find because yes, we are hurt people, wounded people, and we want to be careful. We're always keeping an exit door, a back door. But love, healthy love of parents to children, where does it stop? Because the child, for example, keeps you up at night, so you stop loving. If that happens, unfortunately, the person who's the parent is in deep trouble. Forget about the child. So the point is, there are things that are infinite. Infinite doesn't always mean that it's a million years, it's beyond the set of numbers. Infinite is in quality. That even at the beginning, you're completely committed to it. So I'm not going to put anyone on the spot, but I have spoken to some people individually, and I've asked them a question. They come to me to counsel about different things. I say, look, let me ask you something. Is there something in your life you're ready to die for? And I don't mean, God forbid, physically die for. All the way. Ask yourself this question. And I don't just mean, for your own survival of the fittest. Something, a cause, a person, a value. Now we live in a world which is a very complacent world. Because of our comforts and our prosperity, we were never forced to ask this question. Our ancestors were forced to ask this question. Now, actually, they had no choice, and they had to fight for something they believed in. They were persecuted, they were killed. So it was very crystallized, those values. But that's when Mesiras Nefesh is another force that comes out of infinite light under, unfortunately, very difficult circumstances. But the fact is, we're also told that we can access that infinite power even if you don't have an enemy outside of you. If you see your own complacency as an enemy, your own comfort zone as one, you can also access it. Because it is ultimately challenges that bring the best out of a person. But you have to be ready to be open to those challenges. You have to challenge yourself. Invite trusted people to challenge you, and that usually brings the best. Now, how difficult is it to invite that? It's one thing, we have enough challenges that are not invited and welcomed. Why would I invite new ones? But remember, when you invite them, they're on your terms. So, as one Rebbe once told a chassid, a very strong word, he said, everybody, life will break all people. So break yourself before you're broken by other things. Because then, sometimes it's without mercy. Whereas if you break yourself, it's up to you to determine where and when, and therefore it can be in a healthy way. So, when you talk about change of ourselves, yes, it's really looking at two dimensions of ourselves and recognizing that one side seems unchangeable, but there's another dimension that's very much so, that very much is open to constant change, and it's about accessing that channel. And accessing, as I said, I mentioned faith, well, I went backward, joy, tshuva, faith, the serious nefesh. And there are others as well that can be mentioned, but they're all tools that help a person access something that is beyond yourself. And just knowing that you need to have something beyond you is a key to all growth. Because it accesses that which is beyond your structure, beyond the structure of your birth, beyond the structure of your life as you see it today. That's what it does. It forces you out of that place. I can speak for myself that I have grown most through the situations where I completely went out of my own comfort zone and went out of the places that I was accustomed to, and doing things that were not as easy. You know, even making the decision to open up a center here. Plenty of reasons to. I've had 1,000 reasons not to do it. You know, I could focus on writing and teaching, or I have to focus on raising money and building and fixing and all that stuff. And I found many, many good excuses. But above all, I realized that these are nice excuses and it's all justifiable, but it's also more comfortable. And sometimes you have to practice what you preach. I wouldn't say this to you if I didn't do it myself. That doesn't make you responsible to do so, but before you say it to anyone else, just remember that. But I will tell you this. It is the single greatest message that a person could hear. You have to know that, yes, you have to, what's the word for it, kick yourself in the pants, or let others do so, in a healthy way, I mean. And you will see what it does is, it's also preventive medicine. Because when you do it, you're on your own initiative, it prevents and weakens others be doing it to you when it's not when you want it to be done. Try it out. You tell me. Because there's no really room for that. You've already written your challenges. So it's written the script of your challenges. So the whole basis of Sfiras Omer, of this period in time of refining our emotions, is really think of it, the emotion as as I said, it's a piece of you. And each emotion has its own personality. And it's critical to break it down. That's why we have the 7 times 7, 49 days. So you take an emotion and you dissect it and you say, okay, here it is. Love. Do I have enough discipline within the love? And then the compassion of love, which is what I do in the book, Omer book, break it down. And when you do that, what you have is at least a snapshot of a part of yourself. And you may be very strong in that area, you may be very weak, or you may be neutral. You know, not strong nor weak, average. But there's definitely areas in these 49 guaranteed that you're very weak in. Or something you may not, even worse than weak, would be you never even thought of it. So at least you're aware now. And then there are some parts, there's no question that you're very strong in. But whatever they are, whether it's strength or weakness or non-knowledge or in between, each of them, once you do that, you can begin to tinker with it, so to speak. Just as a doctor would do so with the human body, you can begin to manipulate it. It doesn't mean you can suddenly change its colors or change its shape, but first of all, you've isolated, so now it's under the microscope, so to speak. And that already is power, because of course the worst of all is denial, or vagueness, or just everything becomes so amorphous that you can't really define anything. You've defined it. And then what happens is, as you understand that part of your personality, you can suddenly open up a channel through the different methods I mentioned, whether it's joy, or it's faith, or going beyond yourself, doing something that you're not comfortable with, to a part of that emotion that you never accessed before. And that's how you can start really changing its wiring. Remember, no system can change itself from within. A system can only be changed from outside of it. If you're part of the system, how could you change it? You're part of the so-called the problem, or part of the structure. So the fact is, by looking at it, you begin to have a certain objectivity, especially if you have the help of another person who can really be objective, and you're able to access another dimension. So here's the thing that is not really talked about in this book. So you take an emotion like chesed, love. So there's the conscious love and the structured love. and all its 7 attributes. But then there's the unconscious love and the unstructured love. And the true change of the structured is only when you open up a door to the unstructured. But you can only do that through the focus, as I mentioned, and through the strength to enter into that unstructured part. Now, this may sound very abstract, so let me give you an example, okay? From the negative would be an example. You have, let's say, a crisis in a relationship, a romantic relationship. Husband and wife have a major fight about something. And let's say it's a given, it's not a petty thing. Serious disagreement, serious betrayal. Something really happened, serious thing between them. You know, if it's petty, or something like that, so then, yeah, it could also create World War III and even divorce, or whatever order. But then you could at least identify it's a petty thing, and if you really looked at it, both of you rose above it, you could figure. But let's say it's a serious breach of trust in some way, or a serious disagreement, a fundamental one. Now, we're also assuming these people love each other, because if they don't love each other, and they never loved each other, so obviously a break is going to just expose the lack of love that was always there, and they will part ways. But if there was true love, and then something happened, a mistake, intentional, unintentional. Human beings are human beings. What happens next? So here you have the situation where, of course, next is, after the fighting, if they're interested in working out, they go to therapy. And therapy, of course, is a journey, a lot of therapists. It never ends with one. It starts a whole process. And if it's a good therapist, maybe some resolution. If there isn't a good one, the problems get worse many times. Or what happens is the anger subsides and they forget and they go back and they never really remedied it. They just, out of convenience, never really addressed it. That's also possible. I'm not going to go through every possibility here. That's not the point. But I want to talk about two scenarios are possible. One is that it festers and festers and continues to deteriorate. So even though there was love, the pain of the breach can ultimately overcome the love. That has happened. And your question, was there true love or not? There may have been, but they didn't have the tools to deal with it. So love is still, ultimately human beings are human beings. Love can be conquered. But then there's another option, which of course is the one I want to address, is the people who through crisis have become stronger. Because they did address it, and let's say with a proper objective advice, both of them honestly looking to dig deeper, you will ask unequivocally, every person that any relationship that has gone through a crisis, serious crisis, and they did dig deeper, they will tell you always one thing: we discovered parts about ourselves we never knew we had. And it was only possible because of the crisis. Moses essentially is really the prime example of this, which is why Yom Kippur is the holiest day of the year, because he didn't take no for an answer when God wanted to divorce the Jewish people after they built the golden calf. And more than divorce, wanted to eliminate them. Some divorces want to do that too. And Moses got up on the mountain and just argued and argued and argued. With God, mind you. So it wasn't like he's going to change God's mind. What did he think? If God didn't think it through, made a mistake. You know what Moses' answer to that was? That there's two worlds. There's God, the way you created the structure. And that's what God, I'm just paraphrasing, God said to Moses, what do you want me to do? They betrayed me. I told them, do not have false gods. They built a false god. What can I do? There's cause and effect. You put your hand in fire, you get burned. What was Moses' response to that? You'd think he'd say, forget about it, forgive them. No. Moses said, yeah, but you're the one that created the rules that when you put your hand in fire, you get burned. And you're the one that created the rules that there's cause and effect. You are the one that can go back and rewire it from its root and access a deeper dimension that's beyond the structure. And that's what love really is. That's what he was telling God. Yes, there's the love of structure when things are working well, so you expect this from them. They have expectations of you, and it all worked out. You love each other. Now there's a crisis. If there's real love, we have to go to a place that's beyond the structure and fix it from there. And God's response to that ultimately was, after he after he heard the argument. And it's not that God didn't know this. Some mystics explain that God was waiting for him to say that because it had to be elicited from a human being. Yeah, God knows there's a beyond structure, but that's God. A human being in the world of structure had to acknowledge there's something beyond structure, and that's when God reciprocated and said, Salachti kidvarecha. I will forgive them as you. Kidvarecha. Why is the emphasis? God should have just said, okay, I changed my mind or whatever. However you explain it, not in anthropomorphic ways. But he says, Kidvarecha, you have prevailed over me. That means you stated something from the world of structure that is absolutely true, and I will give you a new gift, and it's called the power of hope, and the power of forgiveness, and the power to be able to change destiny, even when there was a real breach. What is the greatest blessing of all? That things work out, or that you know that you can fix something even if it's broken. So it took 40 days for God to give the law to Moses, but it took 80 days for Moses to receive this new L'mayla Meseder Shtalshus, this new power that is beyond the structure. 40 days to get the structure, and 80 days to repair a breach in the structure, because it comes from a place that's beyond the structure. Double the amount of time. And Yom Kippur is the day when Moses returns with the 2 tablets that were broken. Again, a breach, a break. And now with complete ones that would remain complete forever. So that's just an example where you see where a higher than structure can come in and actually bring in a dimension that the structure can never have. Now, obviously, I gave an example of a negative situation. Can it be done in positive ways? Absolutely. That's why there's faith, there's joy. This one I described as tshuva. But faith, joy, mesiras nefesh in a positive way. When you commit to something that's beyond rational commitment, in a healthy way, that is opening up the channel of something that's beyond structure. Because human beings change all the time. Our moods change. Why would you be committed to something so unconditionally? That commitment is itself the power of the infinite. And we have the power to do it. We see it all the time. People have done it. All the time, maybe is a strong word. It's not that common. But each of you have that power. And it may not even be in very dramatic ways. I made a commitment. It didn't even begin as a commitment, to be honest. When this class began, this was so long ago, 82. Man, a lot. I wasn't 17, 18, but it was not far from there. And it began almost completely, what would you say? No accidents, ashgacha pratis. But it wasn't planned, let's put it this way. So a guy came to me, called me up, a friend of his in Miami, suggested he speak to me about some spiritual inspiration. I was busy then. My full-time work was writing the talks of the Rebbe, which was completely consuming work, day and night. And there was heavy research, like behind library walls. This was not exactly conducive to just giving a class where you have to explain it to people who don't have necessarily any background. And I don't mean that in a condescending way. It just meant it was a completely different environment. But we met, and we hit it off. And those 2 guys, they brought a friend, who brought a friend, who brought a friend. You're all here as an extension of those friends, one way or another. Because it was never advertised. It's purely word of mouth. And I would say by now, maybe 30,000 people have come. I don't even know. Those days we didn't have databases. We didn't even care, to be honest. I gave the class. I went home. They went home, and that was it. And as the years rolled on, I suddenly realized, after a little while, I realized I'm doing this every week. And of course, there were always reasons not to do it. Traveling, sickness, holidays. But I realized that a part of this, and I don't know, it was instinctively, maybe the way I was trained, you start something, you don't stop it. So every week, sometimes 1 person came, sometimes 10 people came. They used to call it the bus from Manhattan, right? And sometimes it was Wednesday night, and it was Shavuos, holiday. And not everybody came to the class, even knew what a holiday was, let alone Shavuos. And the people, they drove up, and here they are. And I'm coming back from synagogue all dressed up. And of course, there's a festive meal at the table. Come in, 3, 4 people came in. I remember it was, what was her name? Alevi. Anyway, Judith, right? Judith. Yeah? You remember her? And a few others. And they say, wow, you really, what's the celebration? So I said that you guys are still coming. That's a celebration. So they came in, they had a whole Shavuos meal. I gave them a Shavuos class. And they had a good meal. And they thought that next week we'll have the same meal. But they didn't. It didn't work out that way. But so slowly they learned about Shavuos. The point I'm making is that it began how it began. And then I did not stop it. Honestly, we would not be sitting here today. I don't think there'd be an MLC altogether had I stopped it. Yeah, maybe doing other good things, but it was a thing. And I look back, it was just almost like trained to think that way. You know, there's so many habits we have that we can't break, unhealthy ones. Might as well build a few that we don't break that are healthy ones. So it became a habit, and I did not stop it, no matter what. All planning a schedule of traveling was all around. I would not leave Wednesday night. Now I've changed a little, not because I have Philip who fills in, or some other thing like that. But I still have the same attitude. So I say to you, in your own way, in a small way, try something like that, and you'll start bringing some infinite light into your psyche. Guaranteed. And as it basks, as it washes over your structure, it will open up changes in your personality. That's not just a rabbi's promise. It's actually a prophecy. Let's put it that way. It is a empirical fact. Try it out. And it's about really understanding that you have that part inside of you, whether you know it or not. So in this period of time, 49 days, we talk about refinement of personality, of emotions. Yes, one part of it is introspection, studying your emotion, understanding it, looking where your strengths and weaknesses. But another part, which is the more invisible part, is that you're accessing through that a whole other dimension. Your objectivity, of the courage of looking at yourself in such under the microscope like that, is itself another way of entering into a world that's beyond subjectivity, because it opens up a door. You know, if a person's not ready to look at themselves honestly, how could that door ever be opened? So the first step is yours, to be able to look, and then new channels open up. All takes work. It will always be work. There's no magic buttons, but there's and it's an exhilarating journey. And trust me when I tell you, I'm in the same boat as you are. We have plenty of things to work on, because it's not something that ends, like you reach your plateau and that's it. It's a journey. There are areas that continuously need work. There are areas that you have to constantly go against the grain of a certain part of your personality. I'm not going to go into a whole group therapy about myself in this way, but self-awareness requires sometimes seeing that certain things, that, you have certain tendencies. You react a certain way to people. You get upset a certain way. Intolerance. All the stuff. And all of that becomes part of the journey. And knowing that we're not asked to be perfect. What we ask to be is accountable. What we ask to be is to be honest in the travel. Now, perfection is not built on, trust is not built on perfection. It's built on accountability. If you're expecting perfection from someone, you will never get it. But accountability, honesty, integrity, that can be expected. And all of that opens up the door to another place. So anything that is not part of the structure, anything that has helped shape the structure, is part of it. Anything that's not part of it. Think about the financial world today. It's riddled far beyond what we know, with corruption, greed, cheating, all the way. If you can get away with it, why not? Human nature. That's all part of a structure. In this case, a flawed structure. What's the antithesis to that? Integrity. Why should someone have integrity? Besides for the incentive not to get caught. Is because you access a part of your soul. It's not because of a personal gain or something. It's a part of a reality, of a higher reality that a person embraces in a way that doesn't necessarily always make sense. Not always the people with integrity are rewarded, and the people that are criminals are punished. We see that today. But just like there's a structure in every area, there's also a structure in that way. So I want to conclude by blessing everyone and myself, and that in this 49-day period we have the power to access that higher dimension, and in a way that it can enter into your life, day-to-day life, as it is right now. Obviously, with more time, all this can be embellished upon and elaborated in more detail. But as they say, Ten l'chacham v'yech kamoed, which means you give some wisdom to wise people, and they can do a lot with it. So do what you can, and we shall compare notes next week. So I want to conclude again saying it was a great honor to have all of you, and that this class has been generously sponsored by our good friend Mark Polinsky. There he is. In honor of his mother, Asya Bat Sarah's birthday on the 25th of Nisan. May she have many healthy years. And bless everyone who needs health or parnasa, livelihood, or above all, a shidduch, a soulmate. Sometimes you need to access beyond the channels and structures to get to that place. So may that be the way. And ultimately, please see me as a friend to open up all kinds of channels between each other on all different ways and levels. So, since after Pesach now we resume our regular schedule Wednesday nights. Tomorrow night, we'll have a good friend, Philip. Please stand up, Philip. Philip comes only from the world beyond structure. And we're trying to get him back into the world structure. But if you want to have a taste of that, he'll be here tomorrow night at 7 o'clock in his Spiritual Creativity series, right here at this same place, different time, and 7 o'clock. He does 7 o'clock in the evening, and he's quite interesting character. And the next Wednesday I shall be here. And for those of you that don't get the weekly emails, which has both the weekly thought I send out and also the schedule, just leave your email address with Golda Malka. Yeah, we're doing our credits now. And Velvel, the guy sitting with his hands folded up right there, are all part of the team that make this place work, basically. So if you please leave your email address, it's a great way to stay in touch. And of course, if there's any way we can help you, I can help you, please access us. Please access me. The doors are open. Channels are open. So with that being said, everyone have a very good night. And sleep well. But not too well. Wake up as well. Okay. Good night, everybody.